This is the Detroit Sports Podcast Network.
Stroz, I'm excited. Normally we like mess around. We talk, honestly, we don't normally start recording for at least 10 to 15 minutes after we get into our Skype call. My clock says 2 minutes and 22 seconds. I wanted to jump right into it, and this is why. I'm excited to do this podcast.
Is it because it's finally over? We get to move on from 2012?
I think it's a couple things, and of course, this is the season recap / look ahead. We're done with the 2012 season, moving on to the 2013 Lions season. It was a disaster year. I don't even remember. 4-12, right?
Yes, 4-12.
4-12.
Brutal.
Very rough. They didn't win a game after week 8. So we've watched a lot of losses in a row, and there's definitely an excitement to being done with that. But also, you know, in the 2011 season, I had a lot of fun, but I don't know if I came away with as many season-long observations as I did this year. So I'm excited to kind of like go over what we learned from the year. And I'm really excited. 2013 is not a special year, but you send me a rundown of just some of the things we're going to talk about today. And you sent me this offseason. And what an offseason the Lions had after the 2012 season. It's honestly probably one of the best off seasons that they've had in my time as a Lions fan. So we are going to get into that as well.
When you juxtapose that to what happened between 2011 and the 2012 season, compared to what happens between the 2012 and 2013 season, it's completely different. So I can't wait till we get into the 2013 season. Like you said, the way it ends up working out, it's not really a special season, but there are some foundational pieces that come into this organization during this upcoming off season. But to start, we got to review the 2012 season, and I think you said it best as we were recording this podcast. This team was better than 4-12. I think we both believe this was a much better team than what their record said that they were.
Well, and I want to say, I think this is important. Going into 2011, I think we both probably had more preconceived thoughts, right? Like we knew it was a playoff team. It's a very memorable team, a lot of memorable games. I don't know about you, but like I didn't really remember what went wrong in 2012. So there was a lot of like genuine starting from scratch. I mean, I remembered bits and pieces of most games, but this season's not a memorable season. And yeah, we came away with the authentic belief that this team was better than 4-12. That being said, I want to jump right into it. This team was better than 4-12, but when we went through the first 8 games, and they come out of the first 8 games 4-4, it felt like they should have been at bare minimum 6-2, maybe 7-1. In the first 8 games, they were a playoff team. And you watch it, and like it's hard not to be furious at Jim Schwartz. In fact, you know, I have positive memories of Jim Schwartz, but watching the first 8 weeks, it was really tough to stomach the games they were losing because they were the better team in a lot of them and just shooting themselves in the foot. That being said, I think this was a tale of 2 entirely separate seasons. I don't know where the breaking point is. I'm going to put it at week 8 week 9 was actually their last win. They had a bye in week 5. I'll put it at week 9 just because that was their last win. It might not have fallen exactly there. But this was a tale of 2 seasons in multiple ways. One way, I think, was Matthew Stafford. The first 9 weeks, I couldn't help but sit there and scream about how well he played and how little help he got. It felt like Matthew Stafford was dragging this team's corpse along with him to try and be a playoff team, and he couldn't get the help he needed. In the second half, I thought he was pretty underwhelming. Now, super, super important to note, I also think it goes almost right in line with when the receiving core absolutely falls apart. Starting this season, I don't know if this receiving core got enough credit. You had the obvious Hall of Fame freak in Calvin Johnson. Nate Burleson might not have been your premier number 2, but he was certainly good enough. Titus Young showed us that he belonged as a playmaker in the NFL if it wasn't for the mental problems. And look, it was short-lived, but Ryan Broyle showed us this receiving core was deep as hell. And he lost every single one of those guys but Calvin Johnson. And when that happened, he just wasn't able to recover. And I think it's interesting, and we'll get deeper into it as we go along in our reroutes. We're gonna drive this thing until we can't drive it no more. I'm not planning on stopping. There's no way we're stopping in 2013 because we got 2014 right after that. That's maybe the most fun year of my Lions fandom. But There's definitely been this narrative of Stafford had Calvin and couldn't do anything with him. Well, in this season, he literally only had Calvin. After that, it was Mike Thomas, Chris Durham, Brian Robisky, and Sean Kappas. I'm pretty sure I'm saying his name wrong, but why would I know? Stroz, I don't even have anything else to say there. I think Stafford played incredible in the first half, struggled in the second half, but he's thrown in literal nobodies. You may as well have been a wide receiver in 2012.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think the big problem was once that receiving core started to get decimated, like you said, he had nobody else. I mean, you went through and you just named a who's who and literally who are they of just bodies that he had to throw to. His second best wide receiver this season was Brandon Pettigrew. Let that sink in. And Brandon Pettigrew. And we
he took a big step
Brandon
back this season.
Yeah, we crucified him throughout this year. Calvin Johnson catches almost 2,000 yards on the season. Brandon Pettigrew is his second wide receiving option, catching something like 893 yards on the season.
Not even. I got him at 567.
Okay, there it is, 567. There you go.
By the way, Tony Scheffler at 500.
I mean, that's insane. He had one guy to throw to the entire year. So what do you want him to do? And you're right. He played a very good first half of the year. But once the bodies start piling up and you've got nobody to throw to, all he can do is force feed Calvin Johnson. To remember, Calvin Johnson gets injured early in this year. And for a stretch in the middle of the season, he is working through that injury. You can see it with his hands. You can see him have some untimely drops. And you can just see him not feeling right through a bulk of the middle of the year. Ends up all getting straightened out, and then in the end, he ends up breaking Jerry Rice's record. But he had no options. And then if you look at the running backs, I mean, as the season unfolded, we discussed how Joique Bell was used, and we discussed how Mikel LeSure was used, but neither one of those guys was explosive. Neither one of those guys had that gear to make other guys miss. They were both fall-forward running backs. And that was fine, but the way this offense was put together, if you look at how it was put together in 2011, you had Javid Best, who was explosive, and this team really did a good job of capitalizing on opponents who couldn't handle that explosivity. And you don't have that with anybody who's in the backfield this season. And I think that helps set this offense back just a little bit.
And I think early on, to some extent, they were able to make up with it with a Titus Young who had some big plays. And even Ryan Broyles had a few big ones as well. But as those guys disappear, there's nothing. I do want to say, I thought it was interesting. You put in the note to me in the email, they didn't have an explosive running back, and that's certainly true. Neither of these guys were breaking big plays very often. I mean, Mikel LeSure's season-long run was 16 yards on 215 attempts. Joique Bell did break a big one, but that's honestly pretty incredible when you think about it. 215 attempts. He couldn't get a single 20-yard run. That being said, I did think as a whole the running game was better than I remembered it. This is the year before they add Reggie Bush, who's probably had the best running back season for the Lions outside of maybe a year of Kerryon Johnson in the last 15 years or so. But Mikel LeSure did have almost an 800-yard year. You got 400 out of Joique Bell. Kevin Smith had a game early on in the season and then disappeared the rest of the way. I guess I wouldn't look at the running game as a major knock. I thought that they were passable, but certainly nothing to be proud of.
Yeah, I think the running game, going into the year, they didn't do anything to address their need at running back. And the upcoming season, Javid Best retires from the NFL. So I think they were counting on him coming back. Of course, he never comes back after, week 6 of the 2011 season. And I think that hurt them. I think they were really putting all their eggs in that basket, and it just didn't really work out. I think something else that really hindered this team was the turnovers. This team did not do a good enough job forcing turnovers, and I think they turned over the ball way too much. They had 33 turnovers as opposed to forcing 17 turnovers. So you basically have a 2-to-1 ratio that's going against you. And I think that really hurt this team, whether it be Matt Stafford or just be the fumbles. If you look at what happened.
Oh my God, the fumbles are incredible. I was waiting for the moment to go to this, not to cut you off there.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
The fumbles are incredible. Matthew Stafford had 6 of his own. A man we're going to talk about, Stephon Logan, a punt returner / kick returner who only saw the field in 15 of the 16 games, fumbled the ball 6 times. I'm sorry. What? You're telling me a below average punt / kick returner was allowed to fumble the ball 6 times? Calvin Johnson had 3. Brandon Pettigrew had 4. Mikel DeShore, despite what I thought was a decent year, had 3. George Bell had 2. This team had 24 fumbles. You said the Lions forced 17 turnovers? So before getting into interceptions, now I don't know how many were recovered. I don't have that number in front of me. But this team put the ball on the ground 24 times in 16 games.
They ended up recovering 8 of those 24.
The opponents?
No, the Lions recovered 8 of
their...
Yeah,
no. 24 was how many times the Lions put it on the ground. I don't know how many of those turned into turnovers.
So 16 of those turned into turnovers. I'm sorry.
So one a game.
Yes. Which is unbelievable when you think about it. This is a team that had so many ball security issues as the season drug on. It's absolutely insane. And I think Matt Stafford this year has 17 interceptions, which some of those were his fault. Some of them weren't his fault. I mean, he didn't have anybody to throw to, so he was throwing to Calvin essentially the entire season, and Calvin was seeing double and triple coverage. I think there was a lot of forcing passes, but again, it's what you had to work with. You had nobody to work with. I mean, Chris Durham, you have to go get Chris Durham, basically shake him out of some mothballs and throw some cleats on him and say, hey, go run some routes.
And while we're talking about the turnovers, I looked this up during the Bears game because I told you the last game of the season felt like just the perfect wrap up of what this season was. So the Lions did have 16 fumbles lost. I had that note in the Bears game. It was the 5th most fumbles lost in the league. First, somehow the Eagles had 22 lost. That's incredible. Lions finished 3rd last in turnover differential, only behind the Eagles and Chiefs. And it's hard to find a stat that speaks to how bad special teams were, because I thought those two, that was where you look at these games and you said the Lions were the better team minus a handful of plays. It really came through in special teams and it came through in the turnovers. Football Outsiders took everything into account. That's kickoff, that's kick return, punt return, and field goals, all that. Special teams, the Lions were rated the 3rd worst in the league. So they were the 3rd worst in special teams, they were the 3rd worst in turnover differential, and that's a lot to overcome.
And think about this too. So the Eagles are a team that the Lions played this season. They ended up eking out a win in overtime, 26.
I tweeted during the game it was the worst game I've ever watched.
Yep. And that was a bad Eagles team. And if you remember that Kansas City Chiefs team, you played them last season. They were absolutely horrible as well in the 2011 season. So 2012, they weren't much better. These were the 2 teams that were higher than you in the turnover differential, and both those teams were absolute garbage. So just for some context, as to where this team was this season and how frustrating it was. You have a team who, on paper, and as we watch these games kind of unfold, besides, like you said, a handful of plays, this looks like a team that could be contending for playoff contention. Instead, what you end up with is a team that's 4-12 and is near the bottom of the league in turnover differential, is a team that in certain games were totally blown out. In other games, they fought tooth and nail, but didn't have enough to win. This was an incredibly frustrating season to watch unfold.
One other thing to wrap in with all of that is penalties. I did look up penalty stats just before we hopped on here, and the Lions ranked 7th in penalty yardage. And here's the interesting thing about penalties.
Did it feel like it was as big of a problem as it was last season? I felt like in 2011, maybe it's because they were in more games and maybe because they were winning more games, that penalties felt like a bigger issue. I mean, we had a penalty tracker last season for the 2011 season. I didn't feel like they were that big of a deal this year.
I thought it was a much bigger issue timing-wise. I thought it was less about volume and more about 3rd downs where you have a chance to get the ball back, giving up a 1st down. Or the amount of times that the offense, I look at first and 10 offensively as a really bad time to pick up a penalty, because you're now telling the offense, you're either telling the offense we're going to throw the ball 3 times, or you're running the ball and you're not doing yourself any favors. But whether or not it seemed like it was bad, Stroz, they did finish 7th most penalty yardage in the league. And what I was starting to say, one of the interesting things about that you find is the teams at the top of the league are usually either very good or very bad. I didn't keep the list up in front of me, but off the top of my head, I can tell you some teams that were very high. Baltimore won the Super Bowl. These are teams that were above Detroit. Baltimore won the Super Bowl. San Francisco lost in the Super Bowl. Washington, this is the year they won the division with RG3. Then the other couple teams, Cleveland, very bad. Kansas City, very bad. and I believe there was one more bad team above the Lions. At the very top, you almost always have teams who are terrible and teams who are pretty damn good. And the Lions fell in the category of terrible.
That doesn't really surprise me. I mean, you think about having an aggressive defense, and that's going to generally lead to penalties. That Baltimore defense and that San Francisco 49er defense, those two teams played in the Super Bowl, like you mentioned. They were spectacular this year. Then you juxtapose that with a team like the Cleveland Browns or the Detroit Lions, definitely not as good. The aggressiveness usually comes back to bite you in the butt. And you're right, when you talk about penalties, on offense, having a false start and forcing your team to start at either 1st and 15 or 1st and 20 does you absolutely zero help, and put your quarterback and put the rest of your team in a bad spot. And there were countless times where this offensive line would either jump early or they would commit a hold, and then you'd have to come back and do it all over again. There were times where the undisciplined play by the defense, like you said, on third downs, where you have a team stop dead to rights. I think it was in the Philadelphia game, week 5. You had this team dead to rights, and then you end up going and committing a turnover after the ball is thrown, and then it gives Michael Vick and that Philadelphia Eagle offense brand new set of downs, and they end up taking advantage of it.
And that was very much what it was. It wasn't even just bad timing, but sometimes it was just inexcusable penalties. You know, third down penalties that you're getting after the play that give them a first down that had nothing to do with the play. Speaking of an aggressive defense, I really only have one other major note. I think you have a couple more you want to get to. Last season, we were fooled early on into thinking this defense was good. I think ultimately I thought it was closer than you did. The secondary had major issues, I thought, all season last year. And that was very much a theme through this year as well. But I think I can feel the progression from last year. It felt like the defensive line just had something there. It wasn't elite, but you could feel that defensive line was doing some things right. This year, I thought the defensive line took another step forward. Kyle Vanden Bosch's numbers went backwards, which is funny because we had some pretty, neither of us thought very kindly of him after 2011 compared to in real time. But I thought the defensive line, a lot of times, played a major role in keeping games close. And we're going to get to it, obviously, in a little bit here. But they made a major addition after the season to the defensive line. In fact, they might have made a couple.
Yeah, I think my big thing that I kind of want to transition out of the 2012 and into the 2012 off season with is just how bad that secondary was. I felt like
terrible.
In certain games, that secondary totally let this team down. Actually, I don't want to say certain games. I want to say in every game, that secondary let this team down. It was picked apart religiously. It was so damn bad. I mean, we talked about forcing turnovers and where this team ranked on the season for forcing turnovers. When it comes down to it, defensively for turnovers, they were 27th in the league. They were absolutely abysmal. And then if you start drilling down a little bit deeper and you look at what happens with this team when in the pass game, it's mind-boggling how bad they are. And I think it speaks to the way that this team was constructed without really doing or adding anything in the off season. Pass defense, this team had 63 pass defenses. Their opponents had 108. Interceptions, this team had 11. 11 interceptions for this secondary on the year. And I think they ended up with 3 multiple game interceptions this season. So there were games where the secondary wasn't forcing any turnovers whatsoever, whereas their opponents had 17 on the year. You got really nothing from this secondary is what I'm trying to tell you. And I think that is part of the problem. I think the defensive front was good enough. I think what you had with Ndamukong Suh and you had Nick Fairley coming on, I think it was good enough. You also have DeAndre Levy taking steps forward, and I thought Stephen Tulloch played very, very well. I don't think you get enough off of the edges with the way this team is currently situated in 2012. But I think your linebacking core is good. I don't think it's great, but I think it's good. I think DeAndre Levy is a special piece at this time. I think what you have in the middle of your defense is very special with Ndamukong Suh and Nick Fairley. After that, it's kind of, let's just put some cones out there and hopefully they trip somebody up, because that's all you really have.
Real quickly, just on the secondary, I think the biggest difference from 11 to 12, and they were bad in 11, but they were worse in 12, was that your number one, Chris Houston, while he definitely was not a lockdown corner at number one, I think you had a passable number one corner in 2011. He took a big step back in 2012, and all of a sudden what was already a weak secondary became an unacceptable secondary, and none of your corners were ever the better player in their matchup.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think a game that highlights that was probably that Atlanta Falcons game. You just go back and you watch a guy like Roddy White and you watch Julio Jones, a young Julio Jones, just eat that secondary alive, and specifically Chris Houston in that game.
All right, you got anything else you want to get to before we move on to next season?
No, I think it's a good time to transition into this 2012 offseason and take a look ahead at the 2013 season, because I think what they do in this offseason is impeccable compared to what they did a year prior.
Hold on. No. I don't want to compare it to what they did a year prior. I want to put this offseason in its proper place. This offseason belongs on a list of some of the best offseasons that any NFL team has had. I genuinely believe that.
Agreed.
I don't think I'm overhyping it.
No, look, I agree.
We all know how I feel about running backs. I don't think they're very important, but Reggie Bush was a quality ad. And I hope you don't mind me jumping right into additions.
No, go ahead.
Reggie Bush, quality ad. Jason Jones was a rotational piece of the defensive line the next couple of years. He wasn't the superstar, but if you remember, what made some of these defensive lines dangerous was their depth, the ability to rotate high-end pass rushers in consistently. Glover Quinn might be the best line we've seen outside of Darius Slay on the defensive side of the ball. I guess Sue's in the same conversation.
We did a podcast about Glover Quinn. That's how important he was to this team. You go all the way back to when we were both at iHeart, when you were in Grand Rapids and I was in Detroit. We did a podcast talking about Glover Quinn. That's how important and impactful this signing was to this team and to this franchise. The Glover Quinn signing, I think, is highly underrated.
Oh, see, when you talk home run signings in football, I'm trying to think of how to put this into context. Glover Quinn, in terms of what he actually brought to the defense, you signed an All-Pro. I don't care whether or not I don't think he ever got listed as an All-Pro. He might have gotten a second team. But Glover Quinn in Detroit was a top 3, top 4 safety every single year. And not only did you bring Glover Quinn in, but you brought him in at less than $5 million a year. You brought in an elite piece in the secondary for very cheap. Obviously, that's the biggest thing, but I really don't think you can underscore what Jason Jones did. They also brought in C.J. Mosley, another defensive end who played a role in the rotational depth. Guy didn't have a long career, but undrafted free agent, Joe Fourier. Look, if you sign an undrafted free agent who has 6 touchdowns in 1 year, he doesn't have to ever see the field again. That is a good signing. And that's what happened with Joe Fourier.
That's another guy, right? Who, like you said, an undrafted free agent, a guy who comes in, gives you 6 touchdowns. He was a freak because he was so damn tall and he was so damn athletic. It's really a shame he didn't have a longer career here in Detroit because fans absolutely loved him. On top of it, side note, I was at Red Smoke one night. This is, if you guys ever listen to the Practice Squad podcast, I tell you all kinds of different stories about some awful things I did there, like making out with some guy's girlfriend down in the basement.
I wondered if that was that place.
Yeah, that was that place. And it might have even been that night. Joe Fourier was in there with his girlfriend and a whole bunch of the other lines. Reggie Bush was there. It was like, it was after a preseason game. Joe Fourier's girlfriend. Bro, you want to talk about hot. On a scale of 1 to 10, this chick came in at like a 17 piece. She was amazing. It was ridiculous staring at her.
Okay, moving on. Sorry, my
That's all I really have to add to it. I don't know.
My laptop's dying on me over here. A guy that, like, you might laugh at me for adding, but I think you do need to look at them differently when they're undrafted free agents. I think Adrian Waddle is not only still in the NFL, I think he might be a starting tackle.
Yeah. No, I seen that name on this list and I was like, man, they had him as well. Like, this 2013 or 2012-2013 offseason is absolutely insane. Some of the pieces that they were able to acquire and grab. Martin Mayhew, like, we crushed Martin Mayhew. Martin Mayhew had an exceptional offseason. And you look at what happens in San Francisco, right? I think Martin Mayhew was actually really, really smart. I think he was really good at his job. I don't think Martin Mayhew gets enough credit because he was the one who preceded Matt Millen. And he had to follow along in Matt Millen's footsteps. I think Martin Mayhew was incredibly intelligent. I think he was pretty good at his job when we look in hindsight.
So I even remember, like, I wanted Mayhew to have one more year. The thing was, I have some weird opinions sometimes. I acknowledge that. I was ready to be done with Schwartz. You know what? No, Mayhew did hire Caldwell, didn't he? Yeah. So I guess, you know what? I do remember not being ready to be done with Mayhew, but we'll see when we get there how we feel looking at it. So, very high free agent class. But, boy, this draft, first round, pick 5, Ezekiel Ansah.
Crushed it.
Yeah, you can't. It looks like he's probably coming towards the end of his career. Had some injury issues at the late back end of the Lions' career, but top end pass rusher. Darius Slay.
Can I tell you about when he was drafted? I was so upset he was drafted.
Oh, I didn't mind this pick.
I did not want Ezekiel Ansah. I wanted Cleveland ended up taking him, and he was a total bust.
The cornerback?
No, he was from LSU. He was a D end. I'll have to look him up, but he was a total bust. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I don't mean to interrupt.
Second round, Darius Slay, elite. Third round, Larry Warford. First year as a starter with the Lions was very, very good. Took a step back, but again, look, this is 2013. This guy's still a starting lineman in the NFL. 5, Sam Martin, punter. I think people hated this pick. I think a lot of people would probably look back and still say it was a bad pick. I say, look, when you get to the 5th round, Sam Martin's one of the best punters in the league, still right now. I don't care what position you play. You could be a kicker, you could be a fullback. If you're one of the best in the league at what you do, not going to complain about taking you in the 5th round. 6th round, Theo Riddick. Probably one of the more undervalued Lions weapons in recent history.
Yep.
I mean, what a draft class. So in one offseason, Martin Mayhew added an elite cornerback, an elite defensive end, an elite safety, a long-term starting guard. I don't know if I want to call Adrian Waddle a long-term starting tackle, but a starting tackle, multiple rotational defensive pass rushers. Devin Taylor, I wouldn't call him a good pick, but he played a role and he was part of this draft as well. The best starting punter in the league, or certainly one of the best, and a very high-end pass-catching running back. I mean, this man added like 9 key players in one offseason. Yep. In the NFL, that's incredible. And he didn't invest in any of them. I mean, first-round draft picks are obviously investments, but none of these guys were expensive.
I mean, how often can you say that you are getting production from a 6th-round pick, and you get it from like Corey Fuller? Say what you want about him. He had some productive years here, but Theo Riddick is a steal at the back end of the 6th round. You look at the 5th round, I mean, Sam Martin, you talked about it. He is still a very good punter in the league today.
He's got to be a top 5 punter.
Has to be. I mean, he hit home runs, and this is something you and I talk about often. He hit home runs. You want guys to be able to come in and start if you are in the first 3 rounds. He hit home runs with Ziggy Ansah, Darius Slay, and Larry Wolford is still in the league playing at a high level. All 3 of those guys are NFL caliber players. That's all you can ask for. He crushed his first 3 rounds. And then he even crushed it later in the draft with his 5th.
This draft was incredible. This is probably, I don't know if you can find a Lions draft, I don't know, dating back to the 80s that was this good. I don't know if there's ever, this might be the best Lions draft ever. Because Ezekiel Ansah and Darius Slay as a 1-2 is incredible. I don't know. Larry Warford isn't special in the 3rd round, but you added a long-term NFL starter in the 3rd round, and then a bunch of rotational pieces in the late rounds. This offseason was incredible. Now, we do need to talk about some of the losses in this offseason, because there are some big ones. Jeff Backus retires. Thankfully, the Lions have Riley Reif ready to step in. We know how that story went. Never a great left tackle. I don't think Jeff Backus was either. I don't know how he had such a long career with the Lions.
But don't you find it funny that a guy like Riley Reif, right? So he's supposed to step in, take over for Jeff Backus. And he's never anything special here in Detroit, but goes to Minnesota. And whether it's the offensive scheme or it's the position he's put in, he is a much better offensive lineman in Minnesota than he ever was at even his highest of highs here in Detroit.
I don't know. I think that sometimes that's the way offensive line works. I think, you got to be a good player, but I think schemes have a lot to do with it as well. Larry Warford's first year as a Lion, he was a stud. Pretty mediocre the next few years, and then he left and was a pretty high-end guard again later on. I want to say he went to New Orleans next. Or he might have actually he had to stop somewhere else too, before New Orleans, I believe. Jason Hanson retires as well. Very underrated retiring, because this year they bring in David Akers, who, if I remember correctly, had a pretty decent year. But the following season, of course the playoff season, they spend half the year trying to figure out their kicking situation. Some other losses that they have. Titus Young, career's over. Got a Shashir list. Right tackle leaves. I'm fairly certain Adrian Waddle takes his role this year as an undrafted free agent. Sammy Lee Hill, rotational defensive tackle. Justin Durant, starting linebacker. That's a loss, I believe, that gets felt this season. Steven Peterman, guard, is gone. Larry Warford, of course, takes his place. And then the biggest change is Cliff Averill, Kyle Van Den Bosch, and Lawrence Jackson all leave. 3 defensive ends. However, again, I want to remind you, Lions did add C.J. Mosley, a defensive end, who was a good rotational piece. They added Ziggy in the first round, who from day one was a pretty good player. That's another thing. He did a pretty good job for the most part addressing what they lost. The only thing they lost and didn't replace whatsoever was Justin Durant at linebacker.
Nope. Yep. That's right. And I think what this team did in this offseason was they had to fill a lot of holes. There was a lot of turnover this year. And they did it a couple different ways. We've already discussed some of the free agent moves where they brought guys in, but I think they did a really solid job in this draft addressing need and hitting on those needs that they needed, especially early in this draft. By the way, the guy that I wanted them to take was Barkevious Mingo. He was the pick who went right after Ziggy Ansah. It was either him or it was D. Milner because they needed help. Yeah, they needed help with the secondary. And I thought he was going to be an absolute stud. Turns out he was a bust as well as Barkevious Mingo.
I wonder if they ended up adding the best cornerback in this draft. You have the draft up in front of you?
I do. So Desmond Trufant was in this draft.
I'd rather have Darius Slay. Funny enough, the Lions now have Desmond Trufant.
You're right. Darius Slay goes in the second round. Let's see if there's anybody else in the first round. D. Milner. And then you've got Tyrann Mathieu, who's an absolute stud.
He plays more safety, doesn't he?
Now he does, yeah. When he came into the league, though, they had him as a cornerback, but yes. And then I think that's pretty much it. I think Darius Slay is Michael Hyde. Michael Hyde is a cornerback, 5th round.
Is he better than Darius Slay?
I don't think so.
I think Darius Slay may have been the best. You know what? Take it a step further. Was Ezekiel Ansah the best pass rusher?
Ooh, let's take a look.
Xavier Rhodes had a really strong run with the Vikings. I think he's really dipped off the last couple of years. He's actually probably the one I would put in biggest contention with Darius Slay. I'm looking through this. Jamie Collins is not really a great pass rusher. So I think the Lions added the best pass rusher and the best corner in this draft.
I think so as well. Looking through it.
Did I see DeMarcus Lawrence? I might have scrolled by. Nope, that was Devin Taylor and Marcus Lattimore. No, I think this was. I think you know what, Stroz, whether or not they're both very much in that conversation, and that speaks to how damn good this draft was.
Yep.
To come out of one draft with arguably the best pass rusher and best cornerback, that's incredible.
Yeah, I think what happens this season with Martin Mayhew at the helm in this draft, I think it's highly underrated. I don't think it gets talked about enough. I mean, it's one of those things you don't really think about until you go back and you kind of look at it and you're like, damn. And I think what you said is extremely accurate. They got the best pass rusher. They got the best cornerback in the 2013 NFL draft. They got 2 primetime studs. And at the time, those were positions of need for this team. Now, Darius Slay doesn't have a great first year, but usually they don't. You're right.
And he's a
but after his first year, he's an absolute stud. And I would argue with you right now, in 2020, he is probably a top 5, maybe a top 10 cornerback in the league right now. I mean, there's not too many guys that you're going to put ahead of him.
And I'm sorry, I don't mean to overkill it because we've been doing this for a while now, and we can move on here in just a moment. Without looking at the class, Glover Quinn was probably the best safety in free agency. I think the Lions, if you look back at articles, probably didn't win this offseason. But if you gave offseason grades retroactively, I bet you the Lions had the single best offseason in 2013. Or 2012, heading into 2013.
I would think so. I mean, look, Glover Quinn, that's another guy who I don't think it's talked about nearly enough for what he meant for this team, what he meant to this organization. I think that's why when a guy like Glover Quinn goes out and does multiple different podcasts and hammers Matt Patricia, I think that resonates with a certain part of this fan base a little bit more because they understand how important he was to this team. They understand how important he was to this locker room. I mean, the guy was a top 5 safety pretty much every single season he was here. He was a stud. And when he speaks, I feel like you should listen.
All right. Anything else you want to do before we look ahead at the start of the season?
No, let's fast forward here.
All right. Next week, we're back to watching games. It's a 7-9 season for the Lions. Thank God we don't have to sit through anything like an 8-game losing streak again. In fact, they actually get off to a relatively quick start. Week 1, it's a win against the Vikings at home, 34-24, before falling to the Cardinals as a part of a long stretch of games against the Cardinals that they just can't figure out how to win. They fall 25-21 in that one. I can already tell we're both going to be upset. I am ready to watch what is going to be a quite different football team this season. From 2011 to 2012, very few changes. A lot more of them this season, and I'm excited to start looking into them.
Yeah, it should be a good time. I think this is going to be a fun look back. Look, they don't
more
end
fun
up
than
going
last
to the
season.
Yeah, they don't go to the playoffs, so I think we have that in mind. I think there's going to be games where we're going to absolutely be frustrated, but it's going to be interesting to see how these guys perform, these players who were drafted by Martin Mayhew, how they perform their first year. Maybe what happens is Darius Slay wasn't as bad as we thought he was his first season. Maybe he was better. I don't know. I remember just being highly critical of him his very first year. Ziggy Ansah was a guy who I did not want them to draft, and he turns out to be an absolute stud. So it's going to be interesting to see how this 2013 season unfolds.
All right, that's going to do it. Coming up next week, we get into the start of 2013 season, 7-9, final year of Jim Schwartz. It's going to be fun. This has been the Practice Squad presents the Throwback.